Protoccells, prokaryotes, eukaryotes, choanoflagellates, multicells, bilaterians, deuterostomes, chordates, vertebrates, jawed fish, euthenopterans, tiktaaliques, acanthostegas, pedipes, hylonomuses, archaeocyrus, saraxodons, morganocodons, purgatoriuses, nosarcutuses, egyptopithecus, proconsuls, ardipithecus, australopithecus, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and Homo sapiens. That is a speed run through the various groupings of animals and specific species of animals, mostly extinct, that we will be discussing today. Protocells, prokaryotes, eukaryotes, all the way up to jawed fish, all of those listed are not exact organisms or species. Those are groups that our actual ancestors definitely belong to, even though the specific species is unknowable right now, especially for the earliest stages where fossils don't really exist for soft-bodied microorganisms. Now, stuff like the tiktaalik all the way through the proconsul, none of these specific species are claimed by paleontologists to be necessarily our direct ancestors either. What these fossils represent, though, are the most likely closest things of those eras of our lineage. The closest fossils we have to direct ancestors for various eras of history. An animal that lived at roughly the same time, in roughly the right place, with most likely similar anatomies to our direct ancestors of that era. We don't have a perfectly unbroken fossil record for every single ancestor in our line. We have the closest known relative at each stage, though, of what our ancestry probably looked like at that point. For the later hominin stages, Australopithecus afarensis, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, well, paleontologists are split, actually, on whether some of these are really on the direct line or just close relatives. Afarensis is one of the more strongly supported candidates for actual direct ancestry. Many paleoanthropologists do think this species, or something extremely close to it, is a real ancestor, not just an estimate. It's still debated, though. Homo habilis is more contested. Some researchers see it as a direct ancestor to erectus. Others argue it may be a side branch, since there is genuine debate about whether habilis is even one coherent species or several lumped together. Homo erectus is widely considered a strong candidate for direct ancestry to later Homo species, including sapiens, probably one of the most confident because it is so well fossilized. Homo erectus eventually gave rise to later species branch-offs, and one of them was called Homo heidelbergus, and it is thought to have split into Neanderthals and Denisovans, and, of course, us. Neanderthals are more of a parallel-running subspecies, not an ancestor directly necessarily. We did end up remerging with them and interbreeding with them because our populations are much larger, though. Neanderthal DNA was heavily diluted. Most of it was eventually weeded out by natural selection over thousands of years. So again, let's go through the list one by one, but a little slower, and one by one try to figure out what all these types of life forms really are. Protocells, some of the most basic life forms around. Might as well be clumps of organic molecules. Oh wait, that's exactly what it is. These guys can't do shit. All they're good for is maintaining an internal chemical environment different from the outside. The basic membrane barrier keeping stuff in and other stuff out is kind of like basically de facto life, except it can't metabolize. Anyways, these are pretty much our most common links between basically all life. As you'd expect, the only stuff more primordial than this is like what? RNA? Amino acids? Do you want me to talk about the elements too? And subatomic matter? How long do you want this fucking video to be? Prokaryotes. Single-cell organisms. Prokaryotes include bacteria and archaea. You may recognize these as two of the three domains in biological taxonomy. Domains of species being the widest, most general, broadest possible classification in biological taxonomy. There are only three domains, and those are bacteria, archaea, and a eukarya. Bacteria and archaea are what's called prokaryote-type cells, and prokaryotes don't have nuclei and have only one cell. Interestingly, eukarya are believed to have evolved from a symbiotic fusion of archaea and bacteria, where some archaea early on ate some bacteria, which started to act like mitochondria inside the archaea. The main cell, its DNA, and the way it replicates are directly descended from archaea, hence why we are more directly related to archaea as compared to bacteria. But obviously, humans came about from eukarya, right? Yes, humans are eukarya, which is why we are under the domain eukarya. All life forms composed of cells with nuclei are eukarya, descended from eukarya. Interestingly enough, humans are more closely related to archaea over bacteria. This is because humans did not descend at all from bacteria, and were more closely related to, for instance, microscopic archaea living in hot springs and deep sea vents than we are to E. coli. Bacteria are very distant evolutionary cousins in this view. The term prokaryote is outdated, by the by, because it used to lump bacteria and archaea together just because they both lack nuclei. Modern science doesn't necessarily use the term prokaryote at the formal grouping anymore, because saying bacteria and archaea are both prokaryotes is like saying birds and bats are both winged things. It may describe what they look like, but it ignores different evolutionary histories. All this stuff of the prokaryotes and the two main types, archaea and bacteria, came about 3.7 billion years ago, by the way. Eukaryotes, more complex single-celled organisms with membrane-bound nuclei and mitochondria. Fancy single-celled organisms, if you will. Our ancestors were at one point in time basic eukaryotes. In life classification and species taxonomy, eukaryotes are one of the three domains, as mentioned. These encompass not only all animals under eukaryotes, as all animals are descendants from simpler eukaryote life forms, but it even encompasses basically all complex life that we can see with our naked eyes, plus a bunch of microscopic stuff too. Amoebas and yeast even fall under this domain. Plants, fungi, animals, us, all under the domain eukaryotes, all of which contain eukaryote fancy cells. Eukaryotes arose about 1 billion years after the first prokaryotes, so about 2 billion years ago. Choanoflagellates, basically groups of single cells working together, teamwork. Specifically, choanoflagellates are mostly unicellular, single cells, though some form simple colonies, basically pseudo-multicell organisms working together, which is likely where multicellular stuff evolved from. These are the earliest, closest living relative that links all animal life, believed to be either free-swimming or attached to surfaces by secreting some sticky adhesive goo, typically made of an extracellular material secreted by the choanoflagellates to keep itself fixed in one spot while it, long story short, drinks water. Choanoflagellates are characterized by a flagellum, meaning basically a collection of single-celled organisms with a whip-like appendage. These things grew in both ocean and freshwater. They measured about 0.001 centimeters, tiny little bundles of working together single-cell life forms, not visible generally without a microscope, believed to most closely resemble stuff like certain cells from certain sea sponges. Choanoflagellates don't have as precise a fossil-dated origin. They're soft-bodied and rarely fossilized. They're understood via molecular phylogenetics to have come about roughly 1 billion years ago. Multicellular animals, metazoans, originated somewhere around 800 million years ago. Multicellularity evolved independently multiple times, not just once on the path to animals, and choanoflagellates are not necessarily an ancestor of the idea of multicellularity in general somehow. I'm just saying that around this stage, stuff became multicellular. In plants' ancestral lineage, for instance, multicellularity is believed to have evolved from a different lineage entirely unrelated to the animal line, which is why plants' most common ancestors to us is eukaryotes, not choanoflagellates. They went down a different direction to multicellularity. Fungi also evolved multicellularity independently, via a separate lineage. Their closest single-celled relatives would be something called nuclearids, not choanoflagellates. Brown algae like kelp comes from a completely separate multicellular origin, in a totally different branch of eukaryotes, the straminopiles. Red algae has another independent multicellular origin. Slime molds achieve a multicellular-like state through a totally different mechanism. Individual cells aggregating, rather than staying attached via division the way plants, animals, and fungi do. Anyways, back on track. After multicellularity came about, you got bilaterians. These are animals characterized by a kind of symmetry during development as an embryo. Bilaterian essentially means an animal with a left-right symmetric body plan, a front and back end. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce the worm. The hypothetical most recent common ancestor of all Bilateria is termed the Bilaterian. The nature of this first Bilaterian is a matter of debate, though. Some think it looked like a funny, weird worm that lived in the ocean. It's believed the earliest bilaterals looked like flatworms or xenoturbella. Bilaterals branched off into various groups. For instance, protozoans continued improving the worm design, leading to stuff nowadays like roundworms, nematodes, annelids, segmented worms like earthworms. This line, protozoans, also eventually led to offshoots like arthropods, that is, insects. Another offshoot of protozoans would eventually become mollusks, like clams, that are like an offshoot of protozoans that learned to live in rocks. But branched off early from the early bilaterals, separating from protozoans, were deuterostomes. The core difference between these two is that protostomes develop their intake orifice first in the embryo, then the excretory orifice, while deuterostomes do this in reverse order. A seemingly small difference that led to wildly different species from the resulting divergent specializations. The protostome and deuterostome lineage split from even before the start of the Cambrian, so we're talking roughly 540 million years ago, at least, likely longer. Again, roundworms, nematodes, annelids, segmented worms like earthworms, these are protostomes, and so are mollusks. Arthropods are an early evolutionary offshoot from earlier protozoans, and under the term arthropods are included crustaceans, arachnids, myriapods like centipedes, and insects. So insects, for instance, are listed as a class, Insecta. The class Insecta descends from and is listed under the phylum Arthropoda, and all arthropods are listed under the clade Protostoma. A clade is any group of organisms that consist of a common ancestor and all its lineal descendants. A single species can be a clade, a genus can be a clade, a phylum can be a clade. I hate this term because I don't understand it. Why not just call it a subkingdom or a superphylum? I don't get it. Anyways, all this to say, insects and really the whole class of arthropods are not in our direct ancestral line. They all diverged and branched out at the junction between whether to develop intake or output orifices first. They went the route of the protostomes, we went the route of the deuterostomes. More importantly, those deviations from protostomic roots came about as new species elsewhere, while those in our direct ancestral line were evolving down a different path. So arthropods, and by extension insects, are not in our ancestral line. Humans are listed as being in the clade of deuterostomes. Deuterostomes went down two separate paths as well. Actually, there was more variance along the way, but none that propagated enough for us to care or notice, at least for right now. Hemichordates, for instance, are a kind of third type of potential deuterostome, but they don't have a spine. They do have some chordate features, though, such as gills. And these really only include like acorn worms and aren't really all that interesting to talk about. The two big-name surviving branches from the clade of deuterostomes include the phylum Echidnodermata, which is weird ocean nonsense that I hate, like starfish, sea urchins, sea cucumbers, and sand dollars. Starfish and sea urchins are our closest invertebrate relatives. We share a common ancestor with them from about 570 million years ago. They don't have brains or blood, but embryo-wise, they develop pretty much the same way we do. On the other side of the deuterostome coin are chordates, which includes everything with a spine. Fish are chordates. That's everything from sharks to goldfish to salmon, and amphibians, and reptiles, and avians, and mammals. You get the idea. All of that falls under the phylum Chordata. The key difference between the two major phyla of the clade deuterostomes is that echidnoderms have no spine. They are invertebrates. Chordates have a spine. We went down the evolutionary path of having one because, well, evolution doesn't have specific motivations, but the likely environmental push may have been that chordate lineage stayed actively swimming and mobile, and a stiff but flexible rod running through the body is mechanically excellent for side-to-side swimming. Look at the way a fish moves today. Echidnoderms, by contrast, trended towards slower-moving, often bottom-dwelling lifestyles, at least as adults, where radial symmetry, spreading equally in all directions, is more useful for filter feeding or sensing food and predators from any angle, and a swimming-optimized chordate design offered little benefit. The earliest chordates were aquatic, not fish, but aquatic filter-feeding worms with a fancy internal rod, flatworm-looking guys. Now, vertebrates are what's called a subphylum, which is between a phylum and a class. All vertebrates fall under the phylum Chordata, but not all Chordata fall under vertebrates. There are two other subphyla under chordates, but they are rather small and uninteresting. Cephalochordata include the worm fish thing called a lancelet, and Tunsicata, which includes sea squirts, which are ugly living coral reef-looking things. Needless to say, these subphyla, as compared to vertebrates, didn't double down on the whole developing a spine idea, whereas vertebrates did, evolving bony spines. Vertebrates also evolved a skull. Vertebrates went two distinct routes again at around 470 million years ago, and this time the big question was whether to develop a jaw or not. Agnatha and Gnathostomata, or that is to say, jawed vertebrates. Agnatha is considered its own class, while because there are so many types of jawed vertebrates, Gnathostomata is considered a superclass. Whatever. Agnatha would be closest to hagfishes and lamprey in modern days. They have skulls and spinal cords, but their mouths are just simple, round, sucker-like holes without any hinged bones. They can't bite or hunt big prey. Mostly, they're just filter feeders or parasites that suck on other fish. The two surviving jawless fish species are nowadays called cyclostomes, roundmouths, and they're literally just the only two surviving branches of the entire once widespread jawless fish tradition. I mean, every other early jawless group, like ostratoderms, went extinct. Jawed vertebrates include sharks, rays, goldfish, cod, frogs, lizard, dinosaurs, bird, whales, dogs, and humans. You and me are Gnathostomos. The evolution of jaws is again a majorly important turning point in humanity's evolutionary lineage. Before jaws, vertebrates were basically, well, you saw, passive vacuum cleaners of the sea. Once they got hinged jaws, they became active predators. This kicked off a massive evolutionary arms race. Jaws led to better hunting, which led to the evolution of faster swimming muscles, which led to bigger brains, which eventually allowed some of those jawed fish to crawl out onto land. Alright, quick recap. A long time ago, like over 1 billion years ago, there were early protocells forming in various pools of water and chemical vents. I'll make a vid maybe on abiogenesis one day, but for right now, point is, over 3 billion years ago, protocells formed. Some of them became prokaryotes. Some of those prokaryotes became fancy single-celled organisms called eukaryotes after some archaea ate some bacteria and got some mitochondria. Some of the eukaryotes worked together to become eventually multicellular organisms about 1 billion years ago, and then came bilaterals, which are cool-looking worms, and then came deuterostomes, and then came chordates, which are fancy worms with backs, and that was around the time of the Cambrian explosion, 540 million years ago. Then vertebrates showed up with fancy bones for a fancy spine, and vertebrates then branched off into those that wanted jaws and those that did not. We were on the side that did, so our ancestors were jawed fish sometime around 440 million years ago. So up to this point, we know our lineage up to the subphylum. In biotaxonomy terms, we are placed in the domain eukaryotes, the kingdom Animalia, because we are animals, the clade of Deuterostomes, we are the phylum Chordata and the subphylum Vertebrata, and the superclass between subphylum and class, Gnathostomata. So far, we have only been able to look at general groups and types of animals our ancestors had to evolve through. At this point in archaeological history, we can look at more specific best guesses for exact species adjacent and closest to whatever really was in our direct ancestral line. For instance, Euphropernon, hard to pronounce, is the next stop in our evolutionary tour. Euphropernon is an extinct genus of lobe-finned fish, preserved as fossils from about 385 million years ago. It was about 1.7 meters long, about the size of a submarine sandwich. This thing was an active carnivore, which means, it ate meat. Lobe-finned fish are distinguished from ray-finned fishes and cartilaginous fishes like sharks. Euphropernon represents a crucial link in the evolutionary chain connecting fishes to terrestrial vertebrates. It used to be considered the missing link between fish and amphibians, but more recent fossil discoveries show that it's just one of many similar animals of this time period. So it's just an example of what a common set of lobe-finned fish that time era looked like. Again, Euphropernon is best described as a close relative, representative of the traditional lineage, not a confirmed literal ancestor. That goes for pretty much most of the stuff here. Euphropernon had some of the earlier, simpler defining features of terrestrial vertebrates, an almost amphibian prototype body, but it seems to have all evolved in the water first, before any animal was walking on land. It did not have arms, but the inside of its fins was built exactly like an arm, bone-wise, surrounded by a fleshy paddle and rin phase. Reverse that last part, fin rays. All that was already evolving into water. Why? The actual evolutionary pressure wasn't fish trying to escape ponds. It was evolving towards that body type already in the aquatic. Euphropernon had a powerful torpedo-shaped body built for swift swimming, with a large tail, 2 dorsal fins, well-developed paired fins. This is an aquatic swimmer, not a land crawler. So what's going on here? Its pectoral fin already shows features illustrating the transition from fish fins to tetrapod limbs. A well-developed shoulder girdle bone, providing a stable base for fin movement, foreshadowing the more integrated shoulder structure seen later in tetrapod. The leading modern explanation is that strong fins were useful for maneuvering and pushing off structures in shallow, weedy, obstacle-ridden water, navigating around plants, other fish, debris in dense, shallow habitats. The fins only later were co-opted for weight-bearing on land once animals were already equipped for it. Tiktaalik lived somewhat later, around 375 million years ago, continuing the same trajectory. Though very similar to and likely evolved from close relatives of Euphropernon, it has a very, very flat head, an extremely flat head. Look at this flat top dude. Also a more mobile neck, and limb-like fins. Creatures like Tiktaaliks, Handerificus, and Acanthostegus have helped scientists better understand this transition, with Euphropernon now understood as representing the type of aquatic vertebrate that gave rise to fishopods like Tiktaalik, which in turn led to the earliest true 4-legged tetrapods. Anyways, strong fins evolved in the water for maneuvering through cluttered, shallow habitats and only got repurposed for land walking later, once the anatomy already happened to be useful for it. Generally speaking, the earliest in our ancient lineage to try this radical ideas was something like, at least, the Tiktaaliks. Rather, it's the one usually credited with being able to prop itself up and possibly venture briefly into extremely shallow water, or mudflats at least. It did not necessarily actually walk on land. Tiktaaliks is technically a fish still, but it's sometimes called a fishopod, because it is in between fish and tetrapods. Clever, right? It's the first animal we know of that could bend its fin forward, which Euphropernon could not do, Tiktaalik still had fin rays at the end of its arm, though, not distinct fingers, and therefore was not a tetrapod. Tetrapod literally just means 4 feet, but in modern biology, it doesn't mean that an animal walks on 4 feet. It technically means any animal that descends from an ancestor that had limbs with digits, that is to say, fingers and toes. By that definition, birds, whales, and snakes are all technically tetrapods, if this classification stuff was not confusing already. Technically, it's worth noting, again, due to these weird definitions, the earliest tetrapods were still entirely aquatic. Our Conphostega was from about 360 million years ago and was basically an aquatic salamander, the earliest tetrapod. It had distinct bony fingers sticking out of its limbs. A Conphostega did not have 5 fingers, though it had 8. Its close cousin, Ichthyosaurus, or whatever, had 7. If you look at its shoulders anatomically, a Conphostega could not have supported its own weight on land. Its limbs were strictly designed for paddling through shallow water, navigating weed-filled swamps, and maybe pushing its head above the surface briefly. It was an aquatic animal with legs. Back on topic. It took another 30 million years after Tiktaaliks and Acanthostegas for a creature called Pedipes to show up and use the evolutionary blueprint of prototetrapods to go on full proto-amphibians. Pedipes. Anyways, yeah, Pedipes is often cited as one of the earliest truly terrestrial tetrapods. This guy had 5 fingers just like us, and they were from around 340 million years ago. Pedipes is basically a proto-amphibian. I mean, it's right on the line where some biologists want to call it an early tetrapod, others say it should count as an amphibian because it is literally a fucking salamander. There was some stuff about animatic eggs around this point that helped inspire folks to ditch the water. You know, this part of the story. There's a massive problem of being a salamander on land. You still had to go back into the water to lay eggs. Roughly around the time of Pedipes, some offshoot of our lineage pulled a crazy biological hack. It took a little time, but the result was the amniotic egg. They evolved an egg with a harder, waterproof shell, and inside, water in the egg, with a private portable pond for the embryo. This single invention meant animals could finally completely sever their ties to their water and move inland. The development of the amniotic egg is actually a semi-big part of evolutionary history, so we are kind of glancing over a big step here, but whatever. One of the earliest known animals to do this was the Hylonomus. The earliest amniotic eggs likely did not have hard calcified shells like a bird's egg. They almost certainly had leathery parchment-like shells similar to modern lizards and turtles. Hard calcified shells evolved later in the dinosaur and bird lineage. These guys, Hylonomus, are some of the earliest reptilians we know of, likely our closest link to other reptilian life forms. They could lay eggs and looked cool. They were from around 320 million years ago. It likely ate small invertebrates such as millipedes or early insects. It ate insects like modern lizards do. I like these guys already. Where are they now? They've been extinct for over 300 million years. Anyways, these guys are the earliest amniotes. An amniote is basically a certain type of tetrapod. Tetrapods include everything from all reptiles, amphibians, avians, mammals. These are all tetrapods. An amniote is specifically a tetrapod that either produces amniotic eggs, like reptilians and avians, or carries the developing embryo internally, like mammals, like us. Amniotes are tetrapods, not bound to water for hosting eggs. Tetrapods can include stuff like frogs, salamanders. Amniotes do not include frogs or salamanders, however, and most living terrestrial vertebrates are, interestingly enough, amniotes. Most living terrestrial vertebrates are amniotes, and every living mammal is an amniote, for instance. Anyways, like I said, the Hylonomus is the closest adjacent known species to our ancestors from that time, 320 million years ago, and is the closest we can get to our common link to reptilians. They marked a point in our evolution where we moved away from reliance on water sources for having kids. Once amniotes arose, as you may expect by now, the lineage subsequently split into 2 branches further, Cyapsinids and Sauropsinids. We humans and all other mammals fall under Cyapsinids, reptilians and avians fall under Sauropsinids. Some of these early amniotes continued down the evolutionary path that would eventually produce the Sauropsinids, which are, to say, reptilians and birds, while another branch, the Cyapsids, eventually led to mammals, eventually us. The earliest amniotes, like Hylonomus, are the common links between these 2 groups. So again, they can be considered our best guess for what links us to reptilians and by extension avians. In this way, reptilians can be considered part of our direct lineage, but not birds, as the earliest amniotes were reptilian, but not avian. As said, amniotes branch off into Cyapsinids and Sauropsinids. Quick side note, Sauropsinids branched off as well, but one half kind of died out. Anapsnids and something called parareptiles made up one half of the major branching of sauropsnids, mostly dead ends. Anapsnids were early primitive reptiles with solid skulls, meaning no holes behind the eyes. Things like big, scaly, cow-sized plant eaters like Scutosaurus. Scoot over, you lump. Almost all of them, all the anapsnids, were completely wiped out by the Permian extinction, also known as the Great Dying, which I guess was named that because the scientist like let his kid named that or something, the Great Dying. Anyways, that happened around 250 million years ago because volcanoes in Siberia erupted too much and turned the ocean kind of acidic. The only possible surviving remnants of this group are modern turtles and tortoises, though this is heavily debated by paleontologists. Turtles might actually belong to the other group. Big dumb cow turtles couldn't drink acid and died. Life is like that. On the other side of the snarpsnids branching paths, we had the diapsnids, the only surviving ones. These are reptiles with two holes in their skulls behind the eyes. This group survived the extinctions. This includes lizards, snakes, crocodiles, and birds. Diapsnids branched off as well into lepidosaurs and archaeosaurs. Lepidosaurs include snakes, lizards, and geckos. Archaeosaurs include crocodiles, petrosaurs, and non-avian dinosaurs such as the T-Rex and Triceratops, and birds. This is all digression. These are not in our lineage. So, amniotes diverged into, on one side, cyapsnids, and on the other side, sauropsnids, which then branched into anapsnids, which most died off, and diapsnids, which became everything from lizards to birds to crocodiles. But what about cyapsnids? The earliest example of a synapsnid is Archaeocyrus. These guys are from 310 million years ago, roughly. These are little, stupid, lizard-looking things, but it's not a lizard, it's a cyapsnid. I just told you that. Lizards are diapsnids, which are offshoot of sauropsnids and not cyapsnids. With Archaeocyrus being the first cyapsid on the block, what exactly does this guy do evolutionarily differently from, for instance, the sauropsnids? Basically, the mechanical difference here is about skull-shaped formation. Cyapsids have one low opening behind each eye socket on the side of the skull. This provided space for expansion and rearrangements of jaw musculature. Diapsnids, like lizards, snakes, crocodiles, have two openings behind each eye socket on each side of the skull. Primitive reptiles and anapsnids had zero such openings in their skulls. The opening was part of a large reorganization of the skull and jaw musculature that subsequently became very important. The sauropsnids, the reptiles and dinosaurs, went the two-hole route, while we went the one-hole route, and Archaeocyrus is the early blueprint of that. Anyways, yeah, Archaeocyrus is our earliest example in the fossil record of a synapsid from around 310 million years ago, and it and other early amniotes lived in foliage and wet vegetation on the forest ground of coal swamp habitats, likely as a carnivore. Next on our list, evolving into existence around 250 million years ago, was the Seraxodon. These are the first ones on the list that likely had fur. These were like possums or flatter wolverines. I bet they hated everything. They look like angry little bastards. Seraxodons count as Cyrtodonts, which are a specialized, highly advanced subgroup of synapsids. Backing up a bit, synapsids have a subgroup known as ceropsnids. Ceropsnids split from their less proto-mammal-like reptilian relatives within the cyapsnids during the late Carboniferous or early Permian, so roughly 275 million years ago. Ceropsnids contain all mammals, as well as a few ancestors and close relatives, and some mammal-like reptiles. Basically, it's a fancy term for mammals and some other stuff from early on. All other non-mammalian ceropsnids died out at the end of the Triassic 200 million years ago. Cyrtodonts are a subset of ceropsnids. Cyrtodonts came about 260 million years ago, and the big evolutionary difference relevant to us would be differentiated specialized teeth, which became a somewhat defining feature for mammals. Heterodonty, or fancy special teeth, actually appears earlier than Cyrtodonts. What Cyrtodonts did was take that idea to increasingly sophisticated levels. Cynodonts represent a gradual change from mammal-like reptiles to proto-mammals, or mammalia forms. Non-mammalian ceropsids gradually disappeared during the Triassic, with only some lineages surviving until the late Triassic. After all, the surviving descendants of cynodonts became mammalia forms and then mammals. Anyways, Seraxodon is one of the earliest cynodonts in the fossil record. Another would be Carassoganophus, which looks fairly similar. Seraxodon is a burrowing carnivore with whiskers and fur and specialized in scythers and canines. I like this guy. Most cynodonts were evolutionarily dead ends, with one particular branch eventually producing mammals. Anyways, Seraxodon. Cool. Next. Morganocodon, one of the first mammals in our fossil record. Around 200 million years ago, there came to be the species known as Morganocodon, which were kind of like giant rats or weird ferrets or some kind of rodent. These were around 10 centimeters long. It is one of the earliest animals to show the transition of certain jaw bones into middle ear bones, which is the anatomical hallmark separating mammals from their ancestors. It almost certainly had fur and was likely warm-blooded, endothermic. It ate insects and other small invertebrates. It was probably nocturnal, an adaptation sought to help early mammals avoid dinosaurs. Mammals started branching out, as you would expect by now. There are monotremes, which lay eggs, marsupials, which carry tiny young in pouches, and placentals, which nourish young inside the womb via placenta. Monotremes are rather different and came about and branched off earlier. Mammals are sometimes divided into monotremes and saurians, marsupials and placentals being the two major types of saurians, also called Metasaria, which include marsupials and their extinct relatives, and Euphora, which are placentals and their extinct relatives. They're much more closely related to each other than either is to monotremes. So we have early mammals, a bunch of different species, and some went the route of continuing the external egg sing, like platypuses and echidnas, while saurians didn't. From there, saurians came to a crossroad where some continued to carry their young in pouches, while we didn't. The fundamental difference is how much development happens before versus after birth. Marsupials give birth to extremely underdeveloped young. A baby kangaroo, for instance, is born after a very short pregnancy. It's tiny and relatively underdeveloped. Essentially, a little embryo like newborn. It crawls from the birth canal to the mother's pouch and attaches to a teat. It continues developing from there. Placentals keep the developing fetus inside the uterus much longer. Placentals provide a highly developed interface for exchanging nutrients between mother and fetus. Placentals diverged into a bunch of different subgroups from there. Cetartiodactyla include whales, hippos, deers. Rodentia include mice, squirrels, beavers. There are many branches, but for now, let's just focus on primates, which include lemurs, monkeys, and apes. Primates are the route we went down. This exact reason for why we're doing it, well, is likely just time and place. Our ancestors lived in regions and environments that selected for primate-like features over generations, while other species of early placentals went a different route because their ancestors ended up in environments that selected for, well, for instance, rodent features, or other branches of the placental group. Introducing Purgatorius. Looks like a tree shrew with particularly dexterous hands and feet, about the size of a squirrel. It ate an omnivorous diet, insects and fruit both, widely considered the earliest known primate, or a proto-primate right at the base of the primate lineage. Some researchers classify it as a Plesidapiform, a group of primate-like mammals just outside true primates. It's one of the most cited candidates for first primate in textbooks generally, though. Purgatorius appears right at the dawn of the Paleocene, a bit over 60 million years ago, meaning it may have lived within a few 100,000 years of the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction that wiped out the non-avian dinosaurs. Some specimens are dated so close to the boundary that Purgatorius may have actually overlapped with the very last dinosaurs or emerged in the immediate aftermath. I bet you don't think this guy looks like a primate. Well, look at this then. Nosarchatus. Basically just a lemur. These guys are from around 54 million years ago, early Eocene epoch. An early true primate belonging to the Adaptiforms, a group of primates often considered close relatives or possibly direct ancestors and direct relatives of modern lemurs and lorises. Nosarchatus is one of the better preserved early primates in the fossil record, unlike Purgatorius, which is mostly known from fragments. Purgatorius was gone by the time these guys showed up. Nosarchatus lived well into the age of mammals, aka the Cenozoic era, considerably larger than Purgatorius, around 30 to 70 centimeters in body length, excluding the tail, roughly the size of a lemur. Yeah, it's a lemur, just look at it. Long hide limbs suited for leaping, a long tail for balance, forward-facing eyes with a good degree of orbital convergence, giving it stereoscopic vision. It had grasping hands and feet with nails instead of claws on at least some digits, both classic primate adaptations for manipulating branches and food. It was a herbivore judging by the teeth, likely lived in trees, as you'd expect. Forward-facing stereoscopic eyes, grasping hands and feet, nails rather than claws, and a leaping locomotion style. It would be immediately recognizable as a primate, even though it's not directly ancestral to monkeys, apes, or humans. Like I said at the start of the vid, these are the closest in the fossil record to whatever our direct ancestral species did in fact look like at the various significant moments in our evolution. But as we approach more modern times, soon we will have to ask, are these uncovered fossils maybe actually, in fact, our direct ancestors? That said, up next, look now. Egyptopithecus, one of the earliest and best known members of the Anthropoid lineage, the group that includes monkeys, apes, and humans. It's like a baboon or a macaque or a bonobo or a chimp, or really all of them rolled into one. It's every type of monkey all at once. It's usually classified as something called a basal catarrhine, and it is at the point of divergence between old world monkeys and apes. These guys came about around 30 million years ago. About 10 pounds, it has a longer snout than modern monkeys, and a more forward projecting face than the Nopharchus. It had a fully enclosed bony eye socket, a post-orbital closure, a trait shared by all modern anthropoids, but absent or incomplete in earlier primates. It likely had a long, non-prehensile tail and moved quadrupedally through the trees rather than leaping like the Nopharchus did. Males and females show size differences, and to say sexual dimorphism, particularly in canine teeth, suggesting social competitive behavior similar to some modern primates. It was a frutivore, primarily ate fruit. Its skull anatomy, the fully closed eye socket and dental features, place it firmly on the branch leading towards old world monkeys and apes, distinguishing it from the more lemur-like adaptive forms like Nopharchus. It's often treated as a reasonable proxy for what the last common ancestor of old world monkeys and apes, and therefore eventually humans, may have resembled. So again, this guy represents the dividing line between monkeys and apes. Primates are the order we share with both Ecopithecus and lemurs, and spider monkeys and chimps and gorillas, all primates, but after this crossroad, the old world monkeys went one route, and the great apes another. Old world monkeys have tails, great apes do not. So, if Nopharchus could be seen as an early lemur, Aegyptopithecus can be seen kind of like an early monkey. What would an example of an early great ape be? Introducing Protoccells. From around 20 million years ago, we had this guy. If Aegyptopithecus was every monkey in one, this dude is every ape in one if I've ever seen it. A little gorilla, a little chimp, a little gibbon, a little human. Yeah. Proconsul is from before the hominids' further divergence into gibbons, orangutans, gorillas, chimps, so it's often treated as a good model for what the last common ancestor of all living apes looked like. They seem to have arrived on the scene during a period when apes were diversifying rapidly across Africa, sometimes called the early Miocene. Tailless, somewhat quadrupedal, swung from and climbed trees, and also moved across the ground. Several species are known, ranging from the size of a small monkey up to roughly chimpanzee size, Proconsul major being the largest. Its brain was still relatively small compared to its body size. A frugivore, likely, a diet of fruit and leaves, lived in subtropical forest. Proconsul marks the point where the tail is lost and a more generalized ape-body plan appears, while still retaining a fairly primitive quadrupedal way of moving through the trees rather than full suspensory locomotion. It's a key reference point for reconstructing what early apes looked like before the lineage split further into great ape and lesser ape, say gibbon, branches. The great ape family tree then gradually diversified in stages. The orangutan lineage splits off first, about 19 million years ago. The gorilla lineage splits off about 10 million years ago. Chimps and humans diverged then about 7 million years ago. After this point, you're specifically in the human lineage. So, would there even be anything left to view as big turning points in our history? Ardipithecus ramidus was an early hominid, meaning it's on the human side of the chimp-human split, but very close to its base. Often used alongside Sahelanthropus and Orrerin as evidence for what the earliest hominids looked like before the more familiar Australopithecus stage. This guy lived 4.4 million years ago, late Miocene, early Pliocene. Roughly 120 centimeters tall, so 4 feet like a dwarf, weighed 110 pounds, estimated. Chimp-sized brain. The famous Ardi skeleton, discovered in Ethiopia, revealed a surprising mix of traits. Skeletal structure implies a more upright and climbing method of motion. Its canine teeth were also reduced compared to chimpanzees, suggesting less male-on-male aggression than in living great apes. It was likely an omnivore, eating fruit, nuts, and other forest resources. It lived in a wooded environment, not open savanna, which challenged older savanna hypothesis idea about how bipedalism evolved. Ardipithecus shows that upright walking began evolving very early, while still largely a creature retaining climbing adaptations. Its bipedalism didn't wait for open grasslands to appear, as was previously assumed. Australopithecus afarensis was the most famous early hominid genus, thanks largely to the Lucy skeleton, a more committed biped than Ardipithecus, though still ape-like with features above the waist. Spans roughly 3.9 to 2.9 million years ago. Again, only 4 feet tall and under 90 pounds. Lucy herself was about 105 centimeters tall and 27 kg, though the species shows a strong size difference between males and females. Brain size is still small, slightly larger than chimps. It had a fully adapted bipedal pelvis and leg structure. The famous Laetoli footprints confirm upright walking, though they retained curved fingers and relatively long arms, suggesting that they still spent time climbing trees. It ate a generalist diet of fruit, leaves, and other plant material. Afarensis is a biped with an ape brain, basically a small-brained tiny human. It had fully upright walking, though the brain hadn't begun the dramatic expansion that defines the genus Homo. It's widely considered ancestral, or very close to ancestral, to later Australopithecus species and eventually Homo sapiens. This is the earliest candidate for an exact species direct ancestor, whereas the prior ones in the list were most likely ancestors representing the common groups of animals at various turning points of our lineage, therefore, kind of conceptual stand ins for whatever our actual direct species ancestors were. But with Lucy, even though there is still great speciation happening over the last few million years, one can't help but wonder, with a fossil of something so closely resembling us, perhaps, screw it, maybe that fossil really is directly in our immediate ancestral line. Homo habilis, often called handyman, is among the earliest species placed in our own genus, Homo sapiens, marking another threshold. These guys lived about 2 million years ago, still small-bodied, around 120 centimeters tall, with a notably larger brain than Australopithecus, a substantial jump in cranial capacity. Face and teeth were somewhat smaller, though still primitive compared to later Homo sapiens. It was an omnivore that incorporated more meat into its diet than earlier hominids, likely through scavenging as well as hunting. Homo habilis is closely associated with the earliest stone tools, Oldowan tools. Lastly, introducing Homo erectus. The body plan we have now is essentially the same. The first to leave Africa in significant numbers and lived from 2 million years ago all the way to 110,000 years ago, an extraordinarily long-lived species, persisting technically longer than any other human species, including our own, at least in terms of total time survived, not chronologically speaking. Taller than habilis, up to 180 centimeters, with body proportions, longer legs, shorter arms, adapted for efficient long-distance walking and running. Brain size expanded significantly over the species' long existence, though still smaller than modern humans. It had a more robust tail with heavy brow ridges and a receding forehead, but for the first time, it was pretty much just a basic body that you'd expect a human to have below the neck. It was an omnivore with significant meat-eating consumption. It used more significant tools, and there is debated but plausible evidence for controlled fire use, which would have allowed cooking. Homo erectus represents a shift to pretty much the full modern body plan, sustained brain growth, sophisticated tool traditions, and the first major hominid migration out of Africa, effectively setting the stage for all the later human species, including the eventual emergence of Homo sapiens. Homo erectus eventually gave rise to later species branch off, and one was called Homo heidelbergus, which is thought to have diverged into Neanderthals, Denisovians, and us. So let's go through one last time to summarize. We are human. Of the three domains, we are in the domain eukaryotes, which came about when some life forms from the domain archaea ate some life forms from the domain bacteria to form fancy cells with mitochondria. From there, after a long journey from working together as single-celled organisms to multicellular life, we gradually entered into the kingdom Animalia. The exact point where we crossed into that line is blurry, but it was crossed by the time our earliest ancestors resembled Bilaterians, like flatworms. From there, we branched out again, taking the route of forming our excretory orifice first in embryonic development as compared to protozoans, who we branched off from 540 million years ago. Protostomes went on to become roundworms, nematodes, earthworms, mollusks, and arthropods, and from arthropods came crustaceans, arachnids, myriapods like centipedes, and even eventually insects. We were Deuterostomes. Deuterostomes went down some separating paths as well. The two surviving big-name branches from the clade of Deuterostomes include the phylum Echidnodermata, which includes starfish, sea urchins, sea cucumbers, and sand dollars. On the other side of the Deuterostome coin are chordates, which include everything with a spine, which is the route we went. This divergence occurred 570 million years ago. Hence, we are of the domain eukaryotes of the kingdom Animalia, specifically Deuterostomes, of the phylum Chordata. Of the three key kind of chordates, we are vertebrates. There is also Cephalochordata and Tuncicata, types of chordates which, as compared to vertebrates, didn't double down on the whole developing a spine idea, whereas vertebrates did, evolving bony spines and a skull. Vertebrates went two distinct routes again. At around 470 million years ago, Agnatha and Gnathostomata, or jawed vertebrates. Agnatha is considered its own class, while because there are so many types of jawed vertebrates, Gnathostomata is considered a superclass. Modern Agnatha would be hagfishes and lampreys. They have skulls and spinal cords, but their mouths are just simple round sucker-like holes without any hinged bones. They can't bite or hunt, and they mostly just use filter feeders or are parasites and eat off other fish and stuff like that. Most Agnatha are extinct. Jawed vertebrates, that is to say, Gnathostomes, include sharks, rays, goldfish, cod, frogs, lizards, dinosaurs, birds, whales, dogs, and humans. And again, we are Gnathostomes. Jawed vertebrates were divided up with time. Cartilaginous fishes include sharks and rays. Ray-finned fishes include most fish in general. Lobe-finned vertebrates include Coelencanas, and one relevant to us, tetrapods. We journey through lobe-finned fish that eventually became proto-tetrapods. Those tetrapods were the earliest proto-amphibians, which gave rise to the earliest proto-reptilians and amniotes. Hylonomus, in particular, were some of the earliest reptilians we know of, likely our closest link to other reptilian life forms. They could lay eggs on land and were from around 320 million years ago. Amniotes branched off into synapsinids and sauropsonids. Sauropsonids branched off as well into anapsinids, which are early primitive reptiles with solid skulls, meaning no holes behind the eyes. The only possible surviving remnant of this group are modern turtles and tortoises, though this is even debated itself. Diapsinids were reptiles with 2 holes in their skulls behind the eyes, lizards, snakes, crocodiles, and birds, and diapsinids branched off as well into lepidosauurs and archaeosaurs. Lepidosauurs include lizards and snakes, geckos, etc. Archaeosaurs includes crocodiles and petrosaurs, that is to say flying reptiles, and non-avian dinosaurs like T-rexes and triceratops and birds. But we are on the side of the synapsinids. The core difference between synapsinids and sauropsonids is skull formation differences. Synapsinids have a subgroup known as cerapsinids. Cerapsinids contain all mammals, as well as a few ancestors and close relatives, and some mammal-like reptiles. All non-mammalian cerapsinids died out at the end of the Triassic 200 million years ago. Cynodonts are a subset of cerapsinids. Cynodonts came about 260 million years ago, and the big evolutionary difference relevant to us would be the appearance of differentiated specialized teeth. Cynodonts led to mammals like Purgatorius, and mammals themselves started branching out from there. Monotremes, which lay eggs, marsupials, which carry tiny young in pouches, and placentals, which nourish young inside the womb via placenta. We are not monotremes, so we are cerians, which include marsupials and placentals, and of the two, we do not have embryos developing outside our wombs, so we are not marsupials, but are rather placentals. We then saw the division come about between monkeys and apes 30 million years ago. One root saw specialization as tree-climbing clever little guys. The other lost their tails and generally got larger skulls. We are on the sides of the latter, the apes. Proconsul is from before the hominids further divergence into gibbons, orangutans, gorillas, and chimps and humans, so it's often treated as a good model for what the last common ancestor of all living apes looked like. They seem to arrive on the scene 20 million years ago. Tailless, quadrupedal, swung from and climbed trees, moved across the ground. The great ape family tree gradually diversified. The orangutan lineage split off about 19 million years ago. The gorilla lineage split off 10 million years ago. Chimps and humans diverged from their common ancestor 7 million years ago. I hope that you can feel a little bit more acquainted with this cast of colorful characters after this vid. I hope that you feel you know a little bit more about the most important crossroads in our evolutionary history